Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. That morning began like any other, quiet and slow, with the kind of soft sunlight that makes you feel as if the world is easing itself awake. I remember standing in my kitchen, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and letting the smell of fresh coffee fill the room. My life at that time felt predictable, even comfortable in its routine. I had reached an age where surprises were rare, and honestly, I didn't think I needed them anymore. That's why I still recall the unexpected knock at my door and how it gently unsettled the calm I had grown used to. When I opened the door, I found my neighbor's son, Daniel, standing on my porch. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, not in years but in expression. His shoulders were slightly tightened, and he held himself as if he were carrying something that didn't quite belong to him. The morning air seemed to hold its breath around him. I could tell right away that whatever brought him here wasn't casual. "Good morning," he said, though his voice carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept well. I stepped aside and invited him in without thinking. I had known him since he was just a kid running around the cul-de-sac with scraped knees and wild curiosity. Now he stood in front of me as a young man, polite but clearly troubled. Something in his eyes made me want to sit him down and let him speak at his own pace, the way you offer someone a warm chair on a cold day. He hesitated before entering, as if making sure he wasn't intruding. When he finally stepped inside, he looked around my living room with the quiet attentiveness of someone searching for grounding. I poured him a cup of coffee, and he accepted it with both hands, like it offered steadiness. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Instead, we listened to the morning sounds, the kettle cooling down, a bird tapping lightly against the window, the distant hum of cars heading to work. I could feel a kind of tension building, not uncomfortable, but meaningful. It reminded me of those moments before someone tells you something important, when even the light in the room seems to shift in anticipation. I didn't know who else to talk to, he finally said, his gaze fixed on the cup he was holding. "I hope it's okay that I came by." I assured him it was perfectly fine. In truth, I felt a surprising sense of purpose rise in me. It had been a long time since someone had come to me not for advice exactly, but for presence, for quiet understanding. I leaned forward a little, letting him know I was listening without pushing him to continue before he was ready. He took a slow breath, and I saw the faint tremble in his fingers. Whatever he was carrying had been on his mind for a long time. As he began to explain the thoughts he'd been wrestling with, his voice wavered between uncertainty and relief, like someone finally setting down a heavy box they'd been holding too long. His words weren't dramatic or shocking. They were human, filled with the complicated emotions that come from growing up, navigating expectations, and facing moments when life doesn't match the picture you once had in your head. He talked about feeling overwhelmed, unsure of his next steps, and afraid of disappointing people. And as he spoke, I realized how hard it must have been for him to show up at my door at all. Throughout his story, I found myself remembering moments from my own life, years ago, when I felt just like him, caught between who I was and who I thought I was supposed to be. Those memories rose gently, like dust floating in sunlight, reminding me that age doesn't erase those feelings. It just gives them new shapes. He paused at one point and looked up at me, searching my face as if checking whether he had said too much. But I met his eyes with calm reassurance, the kind that only comes with experience and a willingness to hold space for someone else's truth. I could see his shoulders ease slightly, the tension softening just enough for him to breathe more freely. As the morning unfolded around us, I sensed something shifting, not just in him, but in me as well. There was a quiet connection forming, grounded in trust and understanding. It didn't need big gestures or dramatic revelations. It simply needed honesty, patience, and the gentle reminder that we all carry things heavier than we admit. When he finally leaned back and let out a long breath, I knew this conversation was only the beginning of something important, something neither of us fully understood yet, but both of us felt. And that is where the real story began. The quiet in my living room after Daniel finished speaking felt almost tender, as if the walls themselves were trying to give him space to breathe. He sat there with his hands wrapped around the warm mug, staring at the rising steam like it held answers he didn't know how to reach. I watched him for a moment, not to study him but to remind myself how unexpected it was for him to come here at all, early in the morning, carrying thoughts he clearly hadn't shared with anyone else. I shifted slightly in my chair and told him he didn't have to rush, that he could take his time. Something in my voice must have soothed him, because he nodded slowly, his shoulders finally lowering from the tense height they had been stuck in since he arrived. He looked younger then, not by years, but by worry. It reminded me how heavy a restless mind can make a person look. "It's strange," he said quietly, "how you can feel like you're doing everything right and still not recognize your own life." His words echoed something I'd felt myself many years ago. I told him that everyone reaches a point where they question the path they're on, and that it doesn't make him weak or lost. It makes him human. His eyes lifted to mine, and I saw a flicker of relief there, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally say those words. He leaned back slightly, as though my reassurance had loosened a knot inside him. The morning sun had climbed higher by then, spilling golden light through the window and warming the space between us. I noticed how it softened his expression, making him seem less troubled, more open. It made me wonder how long he'd been carrying these feelings alone. "I didn't want to tell my mom," he admitted. "She worries enough already. And my dad. He means well, but he thinks everything can be fixed by just trying harder." He gave a small, tired laugh. "Sometimes trying harder just makes things feel heavier." I felt a deep, familiar ache at his words. I had known that feeling too well for too many years, trying, pushing, pretending you're holding everything together while something inside you quietly frays. I shifted my seat closer, not too close, just enough so he would feel I was there with him, not watching from a distance. "Life isn't a straight line," I said, "and you're not failing because you're confused. You're just growing. Sometimes growing hurts more than anything else." For a moment, he didn't respond. Instead, he looked around my living room with a soft, almost nostalgic expression, as if the calmness of the space eased something inside him. It made me wonder whether he had come here not only to talk, but to feel the quiet that he couldn't seem to find anywhere else. He took another sip of coffee and set the mug gently on the table. Then he looked at me in a way that felt different, more deliberate, more vulnerable. Not uncomfortable, just honest. It was the kind of look someone gives when they feel safe enough to say the next thing that has been sitting on their chest. "Can I tell you something else?" he asked, his voice lower, steadier. "Of course," I said. "You can tell me whatever you need to." He hesitated, searching for the right words. His fingers tapped softly on the side of his mug, a quiet rhythm that told me he was building up to something important. "It wasn't just the confusion," he finally said. "It was the feeling that I didn't belong anywhere for a while. Not with friends, not at work, not even with myself. I woke up this morning and felt like I needed to talk to someone who actually listens." His voice cracked just slightly on that last word, listens, and I felt something inside me respond in a way I hadn't expected. There was a warmth, a familiar instinct to comfort, but deeper too, like remembering a part of myself I hadn't used in a long time. "You're not alone," I told him softly. "And you're not difficult to understand. You just needed a place to let it out." He exhaled slowly, as if my words released tension he didn't even realize he'd been holding. The morning light seemed to settle around us like a soft blanket, filling the room with a quiet gentleness that made everything feel a little more manageable. Then he looked at me again with that same thoughtful openness. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't expect this morning to feel." easier. But it does. His gratitude wasn't dramatic. It was sincere, calm, and unexpectedly moving. It settled in the air between us, changing the tone of the moment in a way I could feel more than describe. Something was shifting, not toward anything inappropriate, but toward a deeper understanding, an emotional closeness that happens only when two people share something real and unguarded. I didn't know where the morning would lead after that, but I knew one thing clearly. Whatever weight he carried when he arrived, it wasn't as heavy anymore. And somehow, being part of that easing made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long while, a quiet sense of connection that stayed with me long after the words stopped. The light in the room had shifted again by the time Daniel settled into a more comfortable silence. The early brightness of morning had turned into a softer, warmer glow, stretching across the floor and touching the edges of the furniture like a gentle brushstroke. It made the room feel smaller in a comforting way, almost like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us, and this quiet conversation neither of us had planned for. Daniel's posture had relaxed. He was no longer sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch, but leaning back slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the empty mug he'd set aside. The tension he had carried in with him had loosened, leaving him looking more like the young man I'd occasionally saw outside helping his father with the artwork, steady, thoughtful, but now more transparent. I found myself studying him without meaning to, noticing small details. The way his hair fell slightly over his forehead, the crease between his brows that hadn't fully faded yet, the way his eyes softened every time he glanced around the room, as if the comfort of the space itself was slowly working on him. It wasn't a romantic gaze or anything inappropriate, just the natural attentiveness that comes when you genuinely care about someone's well-being. I shifted my own posture, drawing my legs slightly under me and turning more toward him. Something about the moment invited openness, not the kind that demanded explanations, but the kind that simply asked you to be present. "Can I ask you something?" I said gently. He nodded. "When you woke up this morning, what made you choose to come here? To my door?" He let out a thoughtful breath, rubbing his thumb along the rim of the mug. "Because you've never been quick to judge," he said finally. "Even when I was younger, you always had this calm way of talking. And lately," he paused, searching for the words. "Lately I've felt like I needed someone who sees things clearly, someone who doesn't expect me to be anything other than what I am." His honesty touched me in a way that was hard to describe. There's something deeply moving about being chosen, quietly, without ceremony, simply because someone trusts your presence. "I'm glad you came," I said, and I meant every word. He looked at me with a softness that held no expectations, just gratitude. "It felt right," he said, "being here, talking to you." There was a moment then, calm, steady, almost suspended, where neither of us spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was full of understanding, like a gentle pause between thoughts. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft rustle of the trees outside. The world seemed to hush itself around us. And then he spoke again quietly. "Can I ask you something too?" "Of course. When you were my age, did you ever feel like things were slipping out of your hands, even when you were trying your best to hold everything together?" His question wasn't casual. It was personal, vulnerable, and it stirred a deep memory inside me, one I hadn't touched in years. I looked down at my hands for a moment, remembering a younger version of myself standing in a small apartment kitchen, overwhelmed by expectations I didn't know how to meet. "Yes," I said softly, "more than once." When I looked up, he was watching me with a quiet attentiveness, the kind that made me feel unexpectedly understood. So I shared a part of my past, not the painful details, but the emotions, the uncertainty, the way I once felt caught between who I wanted to be and who others thought I should be. As I spoke, he listened with a sincerity that felt rare, his expression shifting with each piece of the story I revealed. "You made it through," he said after a moment, almost as if reassuring himself as much as acknowledging me. "I did," I replied, "and so will you. But it's easier when you don't try to do it all alone." He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "It helps hearing it from someone who's lived more life than I have," he admitted with a quiet smile. "Not because you're older, just wiser." The compliment made me chuckle softly, though his sincerity warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. There was no flattery in his tone, no hidden intention, just genuine respect, the kind that forms a bridge between two people regardless of age. I noticed then how comfortable we had become sitting there, how the conversation had shifted from his worries to something more balanced, more mutual. Not a heavy talk, but a meaningful one. The connection between us wasn't dramatic. It was calm, thoughtful, and unexpectedly deep. When he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, he said something that lingered in the air. "I didn't expect today to feel different," he said quietly. "But it does. I feel lighter. And I feel like I'm really seeing things, not just reacting to them." I felt that same shift in myself too, subtle but unmistakable. An emotional closeness had settled between us, one built not on anything inappropriate, but on honesty, trust, and the simple act of being present for each other. The morning outside was growing brighter, but inside, something gentler was unfolding, something that made the world feel a little smaller, a little quieter, and much more meaningful than I had anticipated when I opened the door to him just hours earlier. The hours had slipped by more quickly than I realized. The soft morning light had brightened into the steady glow of late morning, warming the hardwood floors and casting gentle shadows that stretched across the living room. Daniel and I remained seated in that same calm space, talking quietly, letting thoughts unravel and settle without rushing anything. What surprised me most was how natural it all felt. Two people at different points in life, finding common ground simply by being honest. Daniel looked calmer than when he first arrived. The anxious crease between his brows had almost disappeared, replaced with a thoughtful steadiness that made him seem more sure of himself. I could sense the weight on his shoulders had eased. Not gone entirely, of course, but softened in a way that made it easier for him to breathe. He gazed toward the window for a moment before turning back to me. "I didn't expect to talk this much," he said, almost laughing at himself. "I usually keep most things inside." "That's a heavy way to live," I replied gently. "Sometimes sharing even a small piece of what's on your mind makes a bigger difference than you realize." He nodded. "I get that now. I didn't think anyone would understand, or care enough to listen." "You deserve to be heard," I said. "Everyone does, especially when something weighs on them." He looked at me with a quiet gratitude, his eyes softening in a way that made the moment feel even more grounded. There was something unmistakably sincere in his expression. No embarrassment, no hesitation, just appreciation for being understood without judgment. "I'm glad it was you," he said quietly. "I feel like you see things in a way most people don't." The words sank into me gently, stirring something deep. It wasn't romantic or misplaced. It was human, warm, and deeply respectful. I realized then how meaningful it can be when someone recognizes the part of you that listens, truly listens, and values it. I smiled and leaned back slightly, letting the warmth of the moment linger. Sometimes all someone needs is a calm space to think out loud. "And you've always had that calm," he said. "Even when I was younger, you never rushed people. You always made conversations feel steady." Hearing him describe me that way made me reflect on parts of myself I hadn't acknowledged in years. Life has a way of pulling us away from our quieter strengths, but moments like this bring them back to the surface. He shifted slightly, running a hand through his hair. "I've been feeling so disconnected from everything lately. Friends, work, even my own plans. But being here today, I don't know, it gave me clarity. It made me feel like I'm not just drifting. "That's because you're not," I told him. "You're finding your footing. Sometimes we only see where we're standing when someone else offers a different angle." He breathed out slowly, and the simplicity of that breath told me how much lighter he felt. "I'll figure it out," he said with quiet determination. "Not immediately, but I know I will." "You will," I agreed. "And you've already taken the hardest step, being honest with yourself." For a few moments, neither of us spoke. We simply shared the stillness, the kind that feels almost sacred because it's born from trust rather than silence. The kind that happens when two people stop pretending they're fine and allow themselves to feel understood. Daniel's voice lowered a little as he continued. "I didn't just come here to talk about my worries," he admitted. "I think I came because I needed to feel grounded again. I didn't realize how disconnected I'd become until I walked through your door." There was something profoundly heartfelt in the way he said it, something that made the room feel warmer. I felt a gentle stirring of emotion, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the sincerity he carried. "And you helped me more than you know," he added softly. I felt that deeply. Sometimes connection doesn't come from grand gestures, but from shared moments, quiet, honest, unguarded. And what unfolded between us that morning was exactly that, two people finding clarity in each other's presence. Eventually, Daniel rose from the couch, stretching lightly as if every muscle was loosening for the first time in days. I walked him to the door, not wanting to rush the moment, but understanding that the morning had reached its natural ending. He turned to me just before stepping outside, the sunlight outlining his silhouette in a soft glow. "I'll be okay," he said with a small smile. "And I might stop by again, if that's all right." "Anytime," I replied. "My door is always open." He nodded, the relief on his face unmistakable. Then, with a gentle wave, he stepped out into the bright midday light. I watched him walk down the path, noticing how different his steps looked, more grounded, more certain, more himself. And as the door closed behind me, I felt an unexpected warmth settle in my chest. That morning had brought something I didn't anticipate, a meaningful connection, a reminder of the quiet power of being present for someone, and a renewed understanding of how deeply a single conversation can shape the heart. It stayed with me long after the house grew quiet again, and even now, looking back, I still remember it not as an interruption to my morning routine, but as one of those rare moments that remind you how much it matters to simply show up, listen, and let both people walk away feeling a little more whole than before.